I am Olivia Carter, 23 years old, and I just graduated in marketing from Boston University. The joy of holding my diploma had not even faded when I was forced to return to the house in Springfield, Massachusetts, a place where, instead of congratulations, I was constantly called a parasite and a burden by my parents. Dinner turned into courtroom sessions, filled with comparisons to the neighbors' children, and finally, my father coldly gave me an ultimatum. Starting next month, you will pay rent if you want to stay. My mother added, maybe that will teach you some respect. That night, my heart shattered. I quietly packed my bags and left. Have you ever been belittled and pushed aside by your own family? If so, let me know where you are listening from so I know I am not alone. That house, from the outside, looked no different from a typical suburban home. A green lawn, a white wooden fence, and a porch where people often hung the American flag on holidays. But to me, it felt more like a cage than a place to return to. My father, David, was a strict man with eyes that always seemed to scrutinize. My mother, Linda, appeared caring to relatives, but behind closed doors she never ran out of criticism for me. They never trusted me, always treating me as if I was living off them, no matter how many times I tried to prove myself. After graduation, I could not immediately land a full-time job, so I split my time between a part-time position at a bookstore in downtown Boston and an internship at a small marketing firm. My schedule was exhausting: mornings commuting to the office, evenings standing behind the counter at the bookstore. Weekends covering extra shifts, but at least I felt I was moving in the right direction. I was not wealthy, nor earning thousands of dollars like some of my classmates, but I knew I was supporting myself. I was not a burden to anyone. But in my parents' eyes, everything looked different. Dinner at our house slowly turned into a repetitive play where I was always the main character under scrutiny. At first, it was only passing remarks, like my father tapping his chopsticks on the table and asking, "So, you went to college for 4 years just to end up working at a bookstore?" His tone was calm, but beneath it was a sharp layer of contempt. My mother never missed a chance to chime in. "Did you hear, Mrs. Johnson's daughter just got hired at a major bank with a great salary and even a separate bonus?" Every time, I forced a smile, trying to explain that I was only just starting out, that the internship would open doors later. But before I could even finish, I was cut off by my father's look of disappointment or my mother's weary sigh. Those seemingly harmless comparisons turned, over time, into direct blows to my self-worth. From saying I was not as good as other people's children, they moved on to harsher words. One evening, when I asked to eat quickly so I could make it to my bookstore shift, my father muttered, "A true parasite, pretending to be busy but completely useless." Before I could even react, my mother followed up. "Raising you feels like charity work. This house might as well be a shelter." I froze, my chopsticks holding a piece of vegetable, my throat tight, unsure whether to swallow or put it down. I thought if I fought back, it would only get worse. So I stayed silent, pretending I hadn't heard. But that silence became a weapon they used to push further, as if there were no boundaries at all. I tried to convince myself they only wanted to push me, that all parents wanted their children to succeed, that maybe their way of expressing it was just too harsh. But the longer it went on, the clearer it became this was not just misguided motivation. It was systematic belittlement, a verdict repeated day after day until I almost believed I truly was worthless. I began to dread sitting at the dinner table, finding excuses to stay late, or claiming extra shifts just to avoid the nightly dissection. But no matter how much I tried to escape, every time I returned home, the air was still heavy, thick with insinuations and sighs. In that picture, my younger brother Ethan was the perfect opposite. He was only 21, still in college, not working a real job yet, but my parents always treated him as their pride and joy. The moment Ethan came home for the weekend, the whole kitchen came alive. My mother would cook all his favorite dishes, and my father would laugh and boast to the neighbors. "Ethan is so bright, he has such a promising future." I sat there, listening to those praises, feeling like my heart was being dragged to the bottom. I was the one actually working, actually earning money, yet in their eyes, I was nothing but a burden. Ethan was the light they worshipped. One evening at dinner, my mother turned to Ethan with tenderness in her voice and said, "Make sure you focus on your studies, so when you graduate, you'll get a decent job. Don't waste your time doing odd jobs like your sister." Ethan leaned back, grinning, nodding, then turned to me with a smirk. "She's right, sis. When I graduate, I definitely won't be stuck with part-time work like you." His words felt like a slap in the face. He was 2 years younger than me, had never paid a single bill, yet he had the right to mock me openly in front of our parents, and the most painful part was that my parents didn't correct him. They laughed along, as if his insult was just a harmless joke. Day by day, month by month, I felt my sense of worth being eroded. I remembered the nights driving back from Boston after an evening shift, the dim streetlights blurring through the windshield, with only one thought running through my head: what did I do to deserve this life? I wasn't freeloading, I wasn't lazy, I was fighting every single day. Yet, in their eyes, none of it mattered. Even when I handed over part of my paycheck to help with the utility bills, my father just waved it off. "That little bit doesn't even count. This house still has to feed you." That single line erased the fragile pride I had been holding on to. The most terrifying part wasn't the direct words, but the way the feeling of being looked down on seeped into every small detail. My parents always spoke to me with a superior tone, reminding me to be grateful, to bow my head. Whenever relatives visited, they would shower Ethan with endless praise, then glance at me with a half smile. "She's still fumbling around, hasn't gotten anywhere yet." I would stand there, forcing a polite smile, while inside it felt like a fire was consuming me. I once thought I could be patient, that if I just worked part-time for a few more months and then landed a stable job after my internship, everything would change. But the mockery never stopped, it only escalated. And because of that, the ultimatum they eventually handed me, forcing me to pay rent just to stay in the house I grew up in, was not a surprise. It felt more like the final shot after hundreds of tiny wounds had already been bleeding. It happened at dinner, like so many nights before, with the kitchen lights glowing and the soft clinking of cutlery against porcelain plates. I had just finished a 10-hour shift at the bookstore, my body aching, my clothes still carrying the smell of paper and coffee. I hadn't even had time to shower or change when my mother called me down to eat. All I wanted was a quiet meal, a chance to swallow a few bites quickly and retreat to my room. But silence at our dinner table was never peaceful, it was only the pause before the next attack. I sat down, trying to keep my back straight, picking up some vegetables, when suddenly my father set his knife and fork down with a sharp clang that froze the air in the room. He looked straight at me, his voice calm, as if announcing something entirely ordinary. "Starting next month, you'll have to pay rent if you want to stay in this house." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My heart skipped a beat, and my chopsticks froze in midair. Before I could open my mouth, my mother cut in, her tone cold but tinged with satisfaction. "Maybe this will teach you some respect." She spoke as if I had committed a grave offense, as if I were some unruly child in need of punishment. The kitchen fell silent. The only sound was the clock on the wall ticking away each second. I sat there, stunned, a storm of questions crashing in my head. Why? What had I done to deserve such a verdict? I wasn't freeloading. I had a job. I paid for my own phone, my car, even part of the bills. I pitched in for groceries whenever I could. But in that moment, all of my efforts seemed to vanish. They no longer saw me as their daughter. They no longer saw me as part of this family. Suddenly, I was nothing more than a tenant in my own home. The frightening part wasn't whether I could afford the rent. I could. I had run the numbers, and I knew I could manage it. What crushed me was the meaning behind those words. It meant my bond with them had been reduced to a monthly fee. It meant the love of my parents could be exchanged for a few $100s. It meant that in their eyes, I was no longer Olivia, the daughter who had just graduated, who was only beginning her life but merely a burden that had to pay her way just to exist under their roof. I tried to speak, my voice trembling. "But I've been working. I've already contributed a part." Before I could finish, my father waved his hand dismissively, as if my words weren't worth hearing. "That's just pocket change. We're not supporting a freeloader anymore. If you want to stay, you pay." I turned to my mother, hoping she might soften her tone, but she only smirked. "People who really work don't whine. If you know what's good for you, you'll keep quiet and do as you're told." Ethan, sitting across the table, casually reached for another piece of meat, the corner of his mouth curling into the kind of smile I knew too well, the smile of someone basking in victory, safely on the winning side. Inside me, something shattered. I still remember the sensation of rice stuck in my throat, like a stone blocking my breath. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I only felt a vast emptiness swallowing me whole. I sat there for a few more minutes, pretending to eat out of formality, but my mind no longer registered anything beyond the pounding of my heartbeat. The world around me blurred. Deep down, I knew tonight marked a turning point. From the moment my parents looked me in the eye and demanded rent, the fragile thread that connected us as parent and child was severed. I quietly stood up and excused myself to my room. No one stopped me. They carried on their conversation about Ethan's prospects, the mortgage payments, their weekend plans. Not one of them bothered to turn and look at me. As I walked away, it felt as if I had already become a ghost in that house, unseen, unheard, and utterly unvalued. I closed my door after that fateful dinner and sat motionless for a long time, trying to convince myself that maybe they had only spoken out of anger. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became there was nothing left to hold on to. Every memory, every fragile hope that one day my parents would acknowledge my efforts had crumbled with just a few cold sentences. As the clock crept toward midnight, I stood up, opened my closet, and pulled out the old suitcase that had been tucked away in the corner. I began folding clothes, placing my laptop inside, a few books, and a small box of personal keepsakes. A photo of me with my grandmother, a worn bracelet from my best friend on my birthday, and a few old letters I had hidden away. Each item I packed felt like proof that I still had value of my own, that my life was not completely defined by them. I packed quietly, careful not to make a sound. The house was wrapped in darkness, with only the faint glow of my lamp spilling out from under my door. Inside me, pain mixed with determination. I knew that if I stayed, I would only continue to be diminished, pushed deeper into the role of parasite, as they called me. When the suitcase was finally full, I looked around the room that had once been my small world but now felt strangely foreign. It was no longer a place of return, only four walls that reminded me of rejection. I stood still for a long moment, heart pounding, then took a deep breath and pulled the suitcase out into the hallway. My old car was parked in the driveway, looking even more worn under the dim streetlights. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk and sat behind the wheel, my hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. When the engine came to life, it felt as if the last thread tying me to that house had been cut. The drive from Springfield to Worcester took over an hour, and that night, every mile felt like a step away from my childhood, a step away from the fragile hope of family I had clung to for so long. Streetlights flashed by like streaks of lightning, and the shadows of trees stretched across the road. I drove in silence, carrying both sorrow and a strange sense of relief. By the time I reached Worcester, the clock was nearing 2 in the morning. I stopped in front of the small apartment of Samantha, my best friend since high school. She opened the door, her hair messy, eyes half asleep, but as soon as she saw the suitcase in my hand, she wrapped her arms around me. "What happened, Liv?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. I just shook my head, swallowing back tears, and whispered, "I just need a place to stay. I can't go back there." Samantha didn't press for answers. She simply pulled the suitcase inside and cleared a spot for me on her old but warm sofa. That night, I curled up listening to the distant hum of cars outside, tears soaking my pillow, but deep down, I felt a strange peace. At least here, I wasn't being looked down on. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, my phone rang. The screen lit up with my father's number. I hesitated for a long moment, ready to silence it, but curiosity got the better of me. I answered, my chest tightening. On the other end, his voice was panicked, hurried. Olivia, your room is empty. Where are you? Why did you leave like this? I clutched the phone, emotions swirling inside me, but instead of explaining or pleading, I delivered one short sentence, my voice calm and cold. You said I was dead weight, so consider me gone. I hung up before he could reply. In the days that followed that call, my phone never seemed to stop buzzing. A flood of messages from my parents poured in like a relentless storm, each one pressing down on my chest. At first came the reproaches. You're ungrateful. We raised you all these years, and now you just walk out like this? Then the accusations. You left home over a little money. Selfish. I sat staring at the screen, my fingers trembling, but I didn't reply. Every word felt like a knife twisting into the deepest part of me. Not once did they mention the insults, the mockery, the wounds they had planted in me for years. In the story they spun, I was nothing more than a traitor storming out in childish anger. Then came Ethan. In the family group chat, my youngest brother, the one still pampered, the one who had never worried about a single day's living expenses, casually typed. Makes sense, adults should give back to their parents. Who works and still expects to live at home without paying. His words poured fuel on the fire. Aunts and uncles reading the thread would no doubt believe I was lazy, that I only took and never gave. I could already picture the family gatherings, whispers spreading. Olivia left home because she didn't want to contribute money. How shameful. Meanwhile, the truth was nowhere close to that. In the middle of my turmoil, my older sister Emily, who had left Massachusetts years ago after her own falling out with our parents, called me. Her voice was low, heavy with sympathy. Mom's been telling the relatives you left because they asked you to pay rent. She's saying you're throwing a childish tantrum, refusing to grow up. I went cold. The whole story had been rewritten, and in their version, I was the villain. There was no trace of the times I was called a parasite, no mention of being told raising me was charity. No one heard about my 10-hour shifts that left me drained. All they saw was a selfish girl who abandoned her family over a few $100s. I sat in Samantha's small apartment, watching as messages flooded in so fast the screen barely had a chance to dim. My father called me ungrateful. My mother wrote, if you still consider this family, then come back immediately, apologize, and speak properly. Ethan, smug as ever, added, if you don't come back, then your room is mine anyway. Just what Mom and Dad wanted. My stomach twisted tight, every breath feeling heavier. I realized then that they didn't just want to push me out, they wanted to rewrite the story so that when I was gone, the image of me and the family would vanish too, replaced by the distorted version they had crafted. What hurt most was the betrayal by the very woman who gave me life. My mother wasn't just punishing me with demands, she was using words to erase all my efforts in the eyes of others. I could picture her telling my aunt in a cold, dismissive tone, Olivia left just because she was asked to grow up a little. She's nothing but a child. They would nod, they would judge me, while the truth remained invisible to everyone but me and Samantha. I felt shock, anger, but above all, helplessness. How could I fight against an entire family all telling a different version of the story? I could write out the truth, I could send messages to explain to the relatives, but would anyone believe me? Or would they only see me as making excuses, confirming exactly what my mother said, that I was a stubborn, sulking child who stormed off? My silence had suddenly become the canvas on which they could paint any picture they wanted of me. That night, I lay on the sofa, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. My phone kept buzzing beside me with missed calls, but I didn't touch it. My head spun with one thought. If I kept silent, I would forever remain the villain in their story. But if I spoke up, I risked making the chaos even worse. I felt trapped, like a fish stranded on the shore, gasping with no way out. Samantha brought me a cup of hot tea, sat down beside me, and held my hand. Olivia, they can say whatever they want, but the truth is still the truth. You know exactly what you've been through. Don't let them make you doubt yourself. I nodded, but inside the bitterness lingered. because part of me still longed for their recognition, still wished that one day my parents would look at me and say, "You've done well." Instead, they turned me into the excuse that elevated Ethan, clinging to the story that they were perfect parents and I was the ungrateful child. In that moment, I realized something. I could not control the way they told my story, but I could control how I wrote the story of my life. If they had cast me as the villain within the family, then I would build a life where the truth would eventually speak for itself. No matter how hard they tried to erase me, I would exist not in their distorted memories, but in the present and future I created for myself. The first days in Worcester were the darkest of my life. There were nights when the streetlights spilled through Samantha's window and I curled under a thin blanket, crying until I could barely breathe. Tears soaked my pillow, spreading into cold streaks against my skin. I cried not just because I had lost a home, but because I had lost the last illusion that family could save me. Those were nights when I felt like I had nowhere left to return to, no one to hold on to. I was erased, no longer present in the story of the family I had once belonged to. And yet, within that abyss of pain, a faint light began to appear. One morning, after a night of sobbing myself to exhaustion, I stood in front of the small bathroom mirror in Samantha's apartment. My eyes were swollen, my hair a tangled mess, my face pale like a ghost. I looked straight at my reflection, and suddenly, the words slipped out. "You will not cry for them anymore." The voice was small, but it was enough to awaken me. I realized that if I kept living in the hope of pity from my parents, I would drown in their quicksand. I didn't want to be the one begging for love. I wanted to be the one who built my own worth. From that day on, I changed. I started asking for extra shifts at the bookstore, willing to take late nights or weekends. At my marketing internship, I threw myself into the work 2-3 times harder, determined to turn that small opportunity into a ticket toward my future. I knew the road ahead would be exhausting, but at least it was mine. I began creating a strict savings plan. Every paycheck was divided into 3 parts, one for bare essentials like food and transportation, one for emergencies, and the largest portion set aside for the goal of renting a place of my own. I cut every unnecessary expense. No more pricey coffee from my usual cafe, just cheap drip coffee from the convenience store. No more meals out, just quick sandwiches or instant noodles. I gave up the habit of buying new clothes each season, wearing my old ones and mending them to still look neat. I learned to live simply, not because it was trendy, but because every dollar saved was another brick in the foundation of my new life. On nights after work, I dragged myself back to Samantha's tiny apartment, tired and hungry, yet carrying a quiet pride. I was no longer the child called a parasite. I was someone slowly, steadily, taking care of myself. Samantha often left little notes on the kitchen counter. "Keep going, Liv, you're stronger than you think." Those few words kept me steady, reminding me I wasn't completely alone. Work slowly became the place where I poured all of my energy. At the bookstore, I learned how to manage shifts, how to organize shelves, how to talk with customers in ways that encouraged them to buy more. At the marketing firm, I volunteered for the small projects no one else wanted, stayed late to revise reports, and absorbed every bit of knowledge I could from my supervisors. I was no longer afraid of exhaustion, because I knew I was building a solid foundation. Every time I got paid, seeing the balance in my account rise, even just a little, warmed me from the inside. No one but me knew how many nights I had cried, how my hands shook as I clicked send on requests for extra shifts. But now, every dollar saved was proof that I had stood back up. I was rewriting my story, no longer the villain in my parents' narrative, but the main character of my own journey toward independence. One evening, I sat by the window of Samantha's tiny apartment, looking out at the bright streets of Worcester. The air was chilly, my breath fogging in front of me. I held the cup of hot tea Samantha had given me and smiled faintly. I thought, I lost everything in that place, but here, I'm starting to find myself again. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a new kind of faith that this pain wouldn't last forever, that from the bottom of the pit, I could climb upward and build a life no one could ever take away. The day I held the keys to my first studio apartment in my hand, I had to stop for a few seconds at the door, inhaling deeply as if I were about to step into an entirely new world. The small apartment was tucked inside an old building in Cambridge, just a 10-minute walk from my job. It wasn't luxurious, not the kind of place people flaunted on social media. The wooden door had peeling paint, the floors creaked underfoot, and the walls bore faded stains from old paint. But to me, it was a treasure. For the first time in my life, I had a space of my own, one where no one could step in to criticize me, no one could strip away my right to exist. The room was just big enough for a single bed, an old wooden desk left behind by the landlord, and a small corner for the laptop I had carried with me. I bought a cheap shelf from a secondhand store to stack my books and pinned a few printed photos from my phone onto the wall, as if to declare, "This is my home." At night, the warm glow of a yellow lamp spread across the corners, wrapping the room in a simple, gentle coziness. I would sit on the floor, leaning against the wall, looking around the sparse but peaceful space, and feel an unfamiliar lightness in my chest. Small as it was, everything in that room was something I had built with my own hands. The first night I slept there, I lay on the bed I had bought with my own paycheck, listening to the faint hum of cars drifting in from the Cambridge streets. I smiled to myself in the dark. It wasn't the softest bed, and it didn't have luxurious sheets or pillows, but it was the only place where I could close my eyes without fearing that, by morning, I would be replaced. I felt a sense of safety that my parents' big house had never given me. Work at the bookstore and the marketing firm slowly became my anchor. When my supervisor at the firm noticed how often I stayed late to polish reports, he began to trust me with more tasks. I was assigned to mentor a group of new interns and given more opportunities to contribute to projects. The praise was small, but enough to make me feel I was no longer invisible. At the bookstore, my manager asked me to oversee shifts and even allowed me to arrange the schedule for the part-time staff. For the first time, I felt recognized as someone truly responsible. After a few months, when my savings had grown a little, I bought a second-hand gray sofa from a small shop in Somerville. The seller helped me deliver it, and Samantha, who had stood by me through all the hard days, struggled with me to haul it up to my second-floor apartment. When we finally set it in the corner of the room, I laughed like a child. That worn-out sofa might have seemed worthless to anyone else, but to me, it was a symbol of victory. I had gone from curling up on someone else's couch to owning my own, in the little apartment I paid for myself. Every morning, I woke earlier, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat by the window as sunlight poured into the room. I opened my laptop, preparing reports or sometimes just writing a few lines for myself. No more shouting, no more harsh comparisons. Just me, the small room, and the quiet certainty that I was heading in the right direction. I realized happiness could be as simple as sitting in a peaceful space and knowing everything around me belonged to me. I began learning how to take care of myself with discipline. I created financial plans, tracked every expense, and each time my savings grew, I felt as though I had added another layer of armor to my body. I was no longer dependent on anyone. Every dollar I had was the result of my own effort, which made it infinitely more precious. One evening, after a long day, I sat back on my new sofa, turned on the warm yellow lamp, played a soft jazz record, and reclined. I closed my eyes and thought about the past months. The empty room stripped bare, my father's look of disdain, my mother's cold words. I had cried, I had hurt, I had despaired, but now I felt myself slowly rising again. I was no longer the girl curled up on a small sofa in Worcester, sobbing until she couldn't breathe. I was Olivia, a young woman building an independent life with her own hands. The small studio in Cambridge wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of freedom, a reminder that I deserved a life I could shape myself, and from that modest room, I knew I would go further still. One weekend afternoon, as I was tidying up the studio, my phone rang. On the screen appeared a familiar name, Emily. My sister rarely called directly, she usually just sent short messages. I picked up, and her voice came through, hesitant. "Olivia, are you okay? There's something I think you should know." I was surprised, but stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. After a pause, she sighed. Do you know why Mom and Dad suddenly demanded you pay rent? It wasn't just about teaching you responsibility. Dad refinanced the house to borrow money for Ethan's startup, the one he's been bragging about for months. The interest rate is higher, and the monthly mortgage nearly doubled. They never said it, but they were counting on you to cover the shortfall. I froze. So, all the sarcasm, the ultimatums, hadn't come from any lesson or sense of duty. I was nothing more than their financial solution, the backup bank to tap into when their golden child's plans didn't hold up. My whole body burned, my hand gripping the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I bit my lip to hold back tears. In my mind, I heard my father's mocking laugh, my mother's cold voice, and pictured the sign taped to my old door. Ethan's room. Now it all made sense. I had never been seen as a daughter. I was just the reserve wallet they turned to when they needed cash. After that call, I collapsed into my chair, my chest burning with rage. I wanted to scream, to call them immediately and throw the truth in their faces. But then I stopped myself. What would screaming achieve? Another fight, another chance for them to erase my voice? They would twist the story again, paint me as ungrateful, and I would be left even more drained. No, this time I would not scream. I would choose silence, but a silence heavy with weight, a silence they would not be able to ignore. From that day on, I began gathering everything that could serve as proof. I saved every text where they called me ungrateful, parasite. I downloaded the voicemails where my mother's sharp voice declared, "If you don't come back, your room belongs to Ethan." I photographed my empty room, already filled with my brother's boxes, and stored everything in a folder I named Truth. I didn't plan to expose it right away. But I needed something to remind myself I wasn't imagining things, that what happened had truly been that cruel. In the meantime, I started paying closer attention. I noticed Ethan's constant social media posts bragging about his tech startup, but behind them were obvious cracks, an unstable office, employees coming and going, and his complaints about rising costs. I began piecing things together: the refinanced house, my father's debt, the endless indulgence of Ethan, and the pressure placed on me. It was all part of a twisted arrangement I was expected to shoulder if I had stayed under that roof. This truth hurt, but it also made me sharper. I realized that in my family's power game, I had never been an equal player. I was the cushion, the safety net, the one meant to absorb the fall so their golden child could chase dreams without consequence. I thought back to every time my parents compared me to Ethan, every dinner where they hurled cutting words at me, and I finally understood. It had all been building to that moment when they would need me to pay for their mistakes. But I also realized something else. I was no longer the trembling child who endured in silence. This small studio, the work I was doing, the savings I had built with my own hands, they had given me strength. I could face them, but not in the way they expected. I would not scream only to be dismissed. I would choose my moment, and when I finally spoke, they would have no choice but to listen, because I no longer depended on them. That evening, I sat alone on my second-hand sofa, the warm glow of the lamp spilling across the notebook in front of me. I wrote down each point. What they owe, what they said, what I know. I listed everything like a strategist preparing for a long campaign. I was no longer seeking their recognition. I wanted to prove that my silence could be stronger than any argument. And in that moment, sitting in the small room, I felt a shift within myself. I was no longer the girl sobbing on a sofa in Worcester. I was no longer the daughter pushed out of her childhood room. I was becoming a woman who knew how to hold power, how to guard the truth, and how to wait for the right time to make them realize just how wrong they were to ever label me deadweight. After months of silence, a message from my mother arrived on a Thursday evening, just as I had returned from a late shift and settled onto the sofa in my Cambridge studio. The words were short. "Family gathering this Sunday. Come home." I stared at that line for a long time, my heart beating slow but heavy, as if my body already knew this was the moment I had been waiting for. Months of silence had passed, months of letting them get used to the fact that my world no longer revolved around them. And now, they reached out, inviting me back. I knew this was not an unconditional reconciliation. This was a trap wrapped in false sweetness, a trap I had known all too well for years. But this time, I would not walk in empty-handed. I would walk in prepared, with strength, and with the resolve never to be buried again. On Sunday morning, I opened my closet and chose the navy suit I had saved for weeks to afford. I smoothed out each wrinkle, slipped into my polished black shoes, and stood before the mirror. Reflected back was a different Olivia, not the frightened daughter who avoided confrontation, but a young woman, independent and confident. In my handbag was something crucial. My phone, filled with saved messages, voicemails, and photos of my empty room with Ethan's boxes inside. I didn't plan to throw them out like weapons, but I carried them as a kind of shield. That evidence reminded me that everything I had endured was real, that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't exaggerating, and I had every right to walk away. As I drove back to Springfield, the familiar scenery appeared, the rows of trees along the road, the sign of the small diner, and finally, the house I once called home. My chest tightened at the sight, not from longing to return, but from knowing I was there to close an old chapter. Ethan's car gleamed in the driveway, as if on display as a trophy. I stepped inside, and the chatter from the dining room hushed when they saw me. My mother rose with a radiant smile I knew was only a mask. "Olivia, you came back. I'm so glad." I gave a slight nod, returned the gesture with a brief hug, and took my seat at the familiar table. The first few minutes passed in a fragile pretense of calm. My mother served the food, Ethan sat scrolling on his phone, my father quietly reached for dishes. But I knew the real moment would come. And just as expected, my father set his chopsticks down, cleared his throat, and said, "Before we eat, I want to talk seriously. Olivia, you should help pay the mortgage. The house is in trouble, and this is the time for you to take responsibility." His tone was measured, but his eyes were sharp as blades. I sat upright, took a deep breath, and spoke clearly. "I have my own life now. I have my apartment, my job, my bills, and my responsibilities. I will not pay for the debts of choices you made for Ethan." Silence hung in the air for several seconds before my mother leaned toward me, her voice tinged with reproach. "You can sit here and watch your own family struggle? We are blood." I met her gaze, then placed my phone on the table and opened the old chat where my parents had called me dead weight, where Ethan mocked me as nothing but a freeloader. I turned the screen toward them, my voice steady, cold. "The blood you're talking about has long since treated me like a parasite. If I am dead weight, then from this day forward, consider that burden gone from your lives." The table fell silent. Ethan pressed his lips together, avoiding my eyes. My mother straightened, her face paling as the fake smile dissolved, replaced by the tightness of suppressed fury. My father's face flushed red as he tapped his fingers on the table. "Watch your mouth. No matter what, we gave you everything." The wall. I leaned slightly forward, my voice calm, neither trembling nor raised. "The only thing I ever owed you was respect. But you lost that the night you turned me into a tenant in my own home. From that moment on, I owed you nothing." The air seemed to freeze. I looked around the table, the carefully prepared dishes, the ticking of the kitchen clock, every eye fixed on me. I knew they expected me to bow my head, to take back my words. But this time, I would not. I slowly stood, pushed my chair back under the table, and said firmly, "Thank you for dinner. Enjoy this house while you still can." I turned and walked away, my heels striking the wooden floor in steady rhythm. Behind me, my mother's voice rang out, sharp and desperate. "Olivia, do you really mean to abandon us?" I didn't look back. The door closed behind me with a resonant click, like the final gavel of a trial that had lasted for years. As I stepped onto the porch, the October night wind whipped through my hair, cold but liberating. I drew a deep breath and felt as if a heavy stone had finally been lifted from my chest. I was no longer a pawn in their game, no longer the backup plan they had casually relied upon. I had reclaimed the right to decide, the right to define my own worth. On the drive back to Cambridge, I played soft music to drown out the echoes of chaos still swirling in my mind. I knew the road ahead would not be easy, that they would try to pull me back, to keep blaming me, to slander me. But in that moment, under the dim glow of the streetlights stretching endlessly along the road, I realized I had truly reclaimed something far more valuable than approval: my freedom. When I returned to my studio that night, I sat at the small kitchen table, opened my phone, and drafted a long message to the family group chat. My hands trembled slightly, but my eyes stayed firm. I typed each word as if cutting through the ropes that had bound me for years. I have removed my name from all joint bills and accounts. I have officially changed my contact address. From now on, please do not call or message me unless it is a genuine emergency. This is not revenge. This is me choosing peace for my life. I read it over once, inhaled deeply, and pressed send. Almost instantly, the screen lit up with replies. First came my father. "You think this makes you mature? Family isn't a game you can just walk out of. We are blood." Minutes later, my mother chimed in. "Olivia, you are selfish. We raised you all these years, and now in hard times you abandon us?" Was all that effort meaningless? Ethan couldn't resist throwing in fuel. "Of course. Everyone knows you only care about yourself. No surprise there." I stared at the stream of messages, but unlike before, I didn't feel anger rising. Instead, I simply turned off the notifications. I had learned that sometimes silence is the strongest answer of all. In the months that followed, I kept moving forward with my work, focusing on new projects, managing the team of interns with increasing confidence, and slowly building a solid sense of stability. Every now and then, Emily would send me short updates about home. Bills piling up, Ethan neglecting his responsibilities, my parents locked in heated arguments over the refinanced loan. I read her words, folded the emotions neatly away like an old piece of paper, and let them go. I didn't interfere, didn't judge, didn't reach out a helping hand. They had chosen Ethan as their center, chosen to label me deadweight, and cast me aside. Now, they would have to live with the consequences of that choice. One early spring afternoon, driving home from work, I found myself turning down the road towards Springfield. At a red light, I glanced into the rearview mirror one last time. The old house appeared faintly behind the trees, gray roof tiles and a bright for sale sign gleaming in the late sunlight. Almost without thinking, I whispered so softly only I could hear, "You wanted me gone. Now I'm truly gone." Strangely, the words didn't bring pain the way they once would have. Instead, they echoed like a release, like the final door closing so I could step fully out of the shadows. No more haunting, no more bleeding wounds, only a stillness spreading through my mind. Back in Cambridge, I unlocked the door to my studio as the afternoon light spilled in through the window. Golden beams stretched across the wooden floor, wrapping around the second-hand sofa and the old wooden desk. I stood there, took a deep breath, and smiled. This was my small but intact world. Here, no one knocked to throw insults, no one invaded my private space. This was the home I had built with my own hands through every dollar saved, every extra shift worked, every tear pushed aside so I could rise again. And because of that, it was more precious than any house they could ever take away. I sat down at the table and opened a blank notebook I had bought long ago, but never used. This time, I wasn't writing lists of expenses or plans to pay bills. I began drafting a long-term plan for myself. I wrote, Year 1, strengthen my career, pursue additional marketing certifications. Year 2, move into a larger apartment with a real living room. Year 3, travel to Europe once, just to see the world through my own eyes. Year 5, buy a small apartment, fully under my name. Line by line, the words appeared like a map sketching out a new path. A life no one could take from me, because it was built on a foundation I chose. When I finished, I set the pen down, leaned back in my chair, and felt a sensation I had been waiting for so long. Peace. I knew the road ahead would still be hard. I would still have to work relentlessly, face comparisons from the outside world, and find ways to nurture bigger dreams. But, unlike before, This time I wasn't carrying the burden of disdain from my own family. I carried only myself and Olivia, who was free, determined, and ready to build a future that belonged to me. Sometimes the memories still returned. Dinners filled with mockery, the empty room that became Ethan's, my mother's sharp voice in the voicemail. But instead of making me tremble, they felt like scars now. Scars that reminded me I had survived, that I had walked through it, and that I had emerged stronger. They no longer defined me, they were simply proof of the journey I had taken. One evening, as I sat reading through my notebook, I added a line just beneath my plan. I no longer search for love in places that have denied me. I will build love from within myself and from the people who choose to stay. I realized then that family doesn't have to mean blood. True family is the people who make you feel safe, who give you a place to grow, who let you be yourself, not the ones who label you a burden and erase you when you no longer fit their image. Samantha, the friend who gave me shelter in my darkest days, was family. The colleagues who trusted me with opportunities were family. And most of all, I who chose to rise was family to myself. That night, I sat by the window, the city of Cambridge glowing outside, each lit window like 1,000 stars. I sipped my tea, smiled faintly, and whispered in my heart to anyone who might be walking a path like mine. If you are belittled, if you are called dead weight, remember you are not. You can create your own home, a place where no one has the right to erase you. I closed the notebook, pulled the curtains back, and let the city lights spill into my small room. An old chapter had ended. I was no longer the girl sitting at the dinner table swallowing insults. I was Olivia, the one who had walked through the storm, reclaimed her worth, and begun writing a new life with her own hands and her own heart.